Tonight, with our Genesis 38 interrupt chapter out of the way, we can now resume the life story of Joseph in Genesis 39. Really, you could just hop from Genesis 37 to 39 and get the continued story of Joseph. And his life, as we read it, is pristine godliness. He shows us really what life can be when you begin to serve God at a young age and then never back down, never stop. D.L. Moody was once asked by his wife after a meeting, after a church service, "Honey, how many people got saved tonight?" And D.L. Moody said, 2.5. And she said, 2.5? Oh, you mean 2 adults and a kid? And he said, no, I mean 2 kids and an adult. He said, because the adult has wasted half of his life in the world, but the kids, they get their whole lives to live with God. I like that about Joseph. I admire that about him. He spent his life with the Lord. It's such a blessing and a privilege for those of you who have been serving the Lord since your youth. It's so wonderful to have all of that time logged in with the Lord and see that growth that happens over the years. But some of us did not come to Christ for salvation until our youthful days were behind us. So maybe you wasted half of your life in the world, chasing after the world. But when a young person truly gets right with God and goes full throttle all through their life, it's a beautiful and wonderful thing, and that's Joseph. We've been learning a lot of Bible truths as we go through the book of Genesis by seeing examples that we don't want to follow. But that is not Joseph. Joseph is a breath of fresh air. Sure enough, anything that you find Joseph doing or saying, it's a good example to follow. You're safe to follow this guy. He's a good example. Last week we read in Genesis 38 of some people that lacked wisdom, had no integrity, and committed some pretty grievous sexual sins. And tonight we get to see wisdom. We get to see integrity. We get to see sexual purity in a man of God. And he's a young guy here. That's what I love about this. He's a young guy that has a relationship with the Lord, and he's full throttle all of his life. A great example for all of us. So let's read verse 1. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. You remember his brothers in Genesis 37 sold him to the Ishmaelites. Well, this bigwig in Pharaoh's court, Potiphar, a captain of Egyptian soldiers, he's the guy that buys Joseph from the Ishmaelites as a slave in his household. So that's where Joseph will start in Egypt, a slave in one guy's house. But watch out, because Joseph is going places. It's a humble beginning, no doubt. It's an undesirable place to be in, no doubt, for Joseph. But you just watch, this guy is going places. You know, great things come from humble origins or even negative beginnings. Jesus taught us that, I think, the best, in a stable. From that stable came the Savior. And maybe that's a good word for our fellowship tonight. When it comes to vision for the future, what are we looking at? Are we looking at our present when we're, looking for vision to the future and hope for the future? Are we looking at our present? Are we looking at our past? Are we looking at a humble beginning? Are we looking at a negative circumstance in the present to dirty up, to muddy up our vision for the future? When it comes to vision for the future, I always think back to the Zechariah 4 vision where Zerubbabel had laid the foundation of the temple, and they were underway. They were rebuilding the temple, and the Lord had to ask the question there, who has despised the day of small things? Unbelievable. Interesting that Considering where they had come from, captivity up north, now they're back in their homeland. They're rebuilding the temple, and yet as the Lord looks out, he sees people that are discontent with the humble beginnings back there in Jerusalem. There are people already discouraged at the very beginning of the work, and they're saying things like, oh, this looks terrible. It's never going to be big and beautiful like the splendor of King Solomon's temple. We lost it. This thing isn't going to be nearly as good. But if you keep reading there in Zechariah 4, I love it when the Lord says, there are some people that are just excited to see the plumb line in Zerubbabel's hand. In other words, let's put this in modern English. There were people among the nation that were just excited to see the tape measures out. Just excited to see that construction was happening because they had a big vision for the future. Those other ones are looking at the foundation. They're saying, no way it's going to be as good. But there were some among the nation that were looking at those humble beginnings and were just thrilled that work was being done. And they had a big vision for what God was going to do there in that temple for the future. They were thinking big. And I got to say, all this work that we're doing here at Anchored, beginning with the stage, has me excited because I'm thinking big. I'm excited. I know that when we're all said and done with the facility changes that we need to make, that it's going to be beautiful. It's going to be wonderful. It's going to be a place that'll, I think, make you proud. We're not going to do you wrong. Let's put it that way. We're building, and I'm excited that changes are happening. I'm expecting something extremely beautiful and wonderful for the future. So what camp should you be in? Not just over the fellowship facility. I'm talking anything here. When it comes to your vision for the future, what camp should you be in? You need to be the one that no matter what the beginnings are, no matter what the present is, you are expecting big things from God because that is the way that God deals with his servants. That's God. That's his character. That's his nature. He's going to do wonderful things. He's going to do big things. And when we get bogged down in negative present circumstances, it can cloud our vision and rob us of the joy of just riding that experience out and seeing what the Lord will do. Joseph was not the guy to do that. Just calm and collected, no matter what situation he was in, he had a trust that he had built with the Lord. Verse 2. Here's why. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. 3. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. I think this calls for rethinking what success and prosperity should look like. He's a slave. He's a household slave. And yet verses 2 and 3 are talking about his success and his prosperity. We definitely need to redefine in our minds and in our hearts what prosperity should look like for the Christian. Was Joseph prospering materially? No. Was Joseph prospering monetarily? No. He was building Potiphar's kingdom. Just with the blessing that was on his life, he was building Potiphar's kingdom. Potiphar's house was getting wealthy. Potiphar's house was getting the goods. So where does that leave Joseph? How is he blessed in this? He doesn't even have freedom. He's a slave. But success and prosperity, as we know, cannot be defined or dependent on financials or possessions. He was prosperous and successful in this way. The Lord was blessing everything that this guy got his hands on. Any situation that Joseph was involved in, it ended up going ridiculously well. And in church, nothing can stop a blessed person, a person that the Lord chooses to prosper. They will prosper. That's just the end of it. You can't stop it. Throw shackles around their hands and feet and they'll prosper. Throw them in prison and they'll prosper. Falsely accuse them and they'll still prosper. You can't keep a good man down. And that's the title of our message. The prosperous person is not the person that gets what they want. The prosperous person is the person that wants what they get. And if you ask me, I think Joseph here gets what he wants. Because if you'll look at verse 3, you'll see that the blessing of God on Joseph's life has caused Potiphar to come to the knowledge of God. It says right there in verse 3 that Joseph's master, Potiphar, saw that the Lord was with Joseph. That's the big payoff for a Christian. That's always it. Not how much money am I making or how much possessions or goods am I bringing into my kingdom, but the big payoff for the believer is always this, that through us, the world comes to experience and know our God. That's the big payoff, and Joseph gets that here. So no complaining and no excuses when it comes to the work that we do or the life that we live. You know, he was an employee, so to speak. He was a slave in the household. He was a household employee. And you won't find him complain. You won't find him complain or give excuses even one time as we go through his story. So learn that lesson well. No complaining and no excuses. Well, I would be a good employee, but fill in the blank. I would be the model church member, but fill in the blank. Excuses and complaining. Joseph had plenty to complain about. I don't have anything to complain about. Joseph did. He could say, well, my family offed me. My brothers were jealous of me and they cooked up a scheme to get rid of me. And now I'm in slavery. I can't see my parents. I'm a household slave. Things are about as bad for me as they can get. So I'm just going to sit here with my hands folded and my attitude bad. But he didn't do that. No excuses, no complaining. He understood a major truth that I hope you understand by now. And that is, no matter where you are, when God is with you, that can be a good place from which you build. And I believe Joseph had that kind of mentality about him, that it didn't matter where he was at the moment, God was his God. And the Lord could get him to whatever height the Lord wanted to get him to. So he's the perfect example of rest, even in the worst of circumstances. Because he knows where he stands with the Lord, and he's willing to wait the Lord out as the Lord is working in his life. Another great example is Job. Now, Job didn't maybe pass the test with flying colors, but considering what Job went through, he did an awfully good job of modeling this for us. You remember when his wife showed up to respond for the first time after all that they had lost. And she said to Job in Job 2 verse 9, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." I think it's safe to say encouragement was not her spiritual gift. Honey, haven't you had enough? Look at how God is treating it. Would you just give it up already? Would you just go back on God, curse him, and die? Well, he says in verse 10, "You speak as one of the foolish women speaks." And now you know why in verse 13 he spends 7 days outside sitting on the ground. "You speak as one of the foolish women speak." And he says, beautiful statement, which I wish we would remember and talk about more. He said, "Shall we indeed accept good from God? And shall we not accept adversity?" I mean, is that what we're all about, servants of God? Will we only accept God is being good when God is doing good stuff for us. But when we hit hard times, does that cause us to question everything? Does that cause us to lose our foundation? Well, Joseph is not the kind of guy to do that. Verse 4, so Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had put under his authority. So we would say, bloom where you're planted. You've heard that probably a million times. Bloom where you're planted. He starts as a humble slave in the home, and now he gets a job promotion. Because the greatness of Joseph, the blessing on his life is recognized, and he goes from slave labor to household management. He's now managing the whole home. How wealthy was this guy Potiphar? Well, the fact that he needed someone to manage his household goods is a pretty good indicator that he was pretty wealthy. As a contrast example, me, for example, I really don't have a need for this position in my home. It wouldn't be merited. I don't have enough stuff to really have to manage. If I hired someone in this position for my home, basically all that household manager would have to do is just make sure my Jeep's still sitting out there in the yard. That's about it. And maybe do some fundraisers for the household. That's about it. But this guy's wealthy enough that he needs someone running the accounting for the home and deciding when and where to plant grain and how to store and all of those sorts of things. And Joseph's that guy. He's in charge. How does he do? Pretty good. Watch this. Verse 5, pardon me. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. So Potiphar's home and even his entire property was blessed by God because of Joseph's relationship with God. Amazing. We see that same thing spoken of by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, where Paul tells us that the entire home is sanctified or blessed because of the presence of one believing spouse or parent. So in short, when the Lord pours his blessing out on the life of a believer, that blessing spills over and wets anything or anyone close to that believer. And this would be a good thing to write down. I love this statement. God blesses in big circles. God blesses in big circles. Let me put it to you like this. If you're standing near the coach that just won the Super Bowl and he gets a Gatorade bath and you're close to that coach, you're getting the Gatorade bath. And that's the way that the blessing of God works. We've talked about this before, I know. I just got to point it out again because I love the thought. If my life is being blessed by God, that should spill over to anyone that gets close to me in life. It should spill out into my home. It should work on my job. It should work at the office. It should work in the church. Anyone that gets close enough to us should be in the splash zone. Now that's different when you're talking about church. You don't want to be in the splash zone or the spray zone. That means, the pastor spits on you. We're talking about the blessing of God here. Anyone close to you should be in the spray zone. God, he doesn't care to keep that blessing just tightly wrapped around you and not spilling onto other people. The Lord is very generous with his blessing. He's more than happy to pour out his blessing, his prosperity on your life so that other people catch the spray of it, get a taste for life with God, and turn to him. Verse 6, thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. So that would be the meals that were set before him. Joseph was so trustworthy and was doing such a great job managing the household that Potiphar realized, I might as well go ahead and take my hands off of all of this and let Joseph manage it, let Joseph run it. I'll just stay out of it, because if I keep my hands in the day-to-day minutia, the organization of the home, the decisions of how to make the home more prosperous, if I keep my hands in it, then for sure I'm going to mess it up. It's not going to come out as good as if I just let Joseph run this. It's sort of like, the same thing that football fans have been saying about Jerry Jones for many years, the owner of the Dallas Cowboys. And recently in the news, Troy Aikman made a statement about Jerry Jones, and he said, I wish Jerry Jones would just step back, take his hands out of all of the decisions, and let his personnel that's trained to recruit talent, his talent scouts, and his general manager, let them run things. Let them scout the talent. Let them sign the contracts that'll make the team better. But Troy Aikman said Jerry Jones won't do that. He's got to keep his hands in everything. He will not. He wants to make all those decisions. And because of that, a lot of people think the team is worse. That's what this guy's thinking. He's thinking the more that I hold on to in the home, the worse it's going to be. Joseph is blessed. He's prosperous. He's talented. He's wise, and if I just take my hands out and let him run with it, the home is going to be so much better off. And it says, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Uh-oh, where's this going? Why would we need to know this unless, verse 7. And it came to pass after these things that his master's wife, so that's Potiphar's wife, cast longing eyes on Joseph. And she said, lie with me. And Joseph said, sorry, I can't do that. I only tell the truth. No, she's not talking about a joint fib here. You know what she's talking about, and not so subtly, I might add. She wants Joseph to sleep with her. Verse 8, but he refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has to my hand. He trusts me so much that he doesn't even keep tabs on his own stuff anymore. He doesn't even keep tabs on his own inventory. He trusts me enough to let me handle all of that, and he's right to trust me because I'm not going to break his trust. I won't do that. Verse 9, there is no one greater in this house than I. That sounds, less than humble. Sounds kind of prideful, but it's not what he means. He means there's no one in a higher position. There's no one in a more important position. There's no one with more responsibilities in the home than he. And he says, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. You're the only thing that is off limits to me. Anything else in Potiphar's home, I have access to and I have right to, except you, his wife. And he says, how then can I do this great wickedness and sin against Potiphar? Wait, did I read that wrong? Well, I thought that's where the statement was going. He was talking about the trust that Potiphar had for him. But when he gets to this statement, he says, how could I do this and sin against, he says, God? How could I do this and sin against God? We learn a lot from that statement. If I'm refraining from sinning against another person, if I'm doing it because I don't want to displease that individual, I don't want to upset that individual, I don't want to trespass against that individual, that's only good for as long as that individual is in my good graces. But if that individual displeases me, if that individual sins against me, then my motivation not to sin against that individual is gone. So if I'm refraining from sin because I don't want to displease God, if I'm refraining from sin because I fear him and I don't want to sin against him, then that's sort of the rock that keeps you in all situations. Proverbs 8:13 says this, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. In Psalm 51 verse 4, when David confessed his sin with Bathsheba and the sin of murdering Uriah, he said there, in Psalm 51, verse 4, God, I've sinned against you and you alone. And we want to say, oh, wait a minute. Hold up a second, David. No, you did sin against Bathsheba. You wrecked her life. And you definitely sinned against Uriah. You had the guy killed. But no, David's right. David's right. He had sinned against God and God alone. That is the purest motivation in our holy living, our attempt to seek a righteous lifestyle. Joseph knows that if Potiphar is mad at him, big deal. Potiphar doesn't make or break him. Same with Bathsheba, same with Uriah, big deal. I sin against people, big deal. They don't make or break me. God is with me. It's God that blesses me. And in Joseph's case, Potiphar was just the current vessel that God was using to bless Joseph. But see, Joseph takes God more serious than he takes people. And I think that's a good, healthy thing. I think it's a good, healthy thing to take God more seriously than you do people. It's a far better way. Because if you love the Lord and you don't want to sin against the Lord, you're not going to be hurting any of the Lord's people. That just sort of sits at the top of all of our aims. If I'm seeking to please God, if I love the Lord, then I'm not going to be sinning against Him, which involves me not sinning against people. Here's another reason why that's the best way. Because you can sin against people and get away with it. You know? You can sin against people if you know you're going to get away with it. And you think, well, no one's going to see, no one's going to find out, and no one's going to know. So if your motivation not to sin is based on people, I don't want to hurt people, well, what do you do then when you know, when you're just sure you can get away with it and they won't find out? See, that's why it's not as good of a motivation. But what do we know about God? We know that He sees all, that He knows all. So if our motivation is not to sin against God, we know this: wherever we are, whatever we're doing, whatever the situation, whatever the temptation, if we sin, there is no way to hide that from God. Verse 10, so it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. So this was, again, I mentioned it last week, but this was not a one-shot temptation. This was an ongoing, daily thing. She was tempting him daily, and Joseph daily passed that test. A young guy, who would, of course, have those desires and those passions. We referred to them as youthful lusts very recently, based on a scripture from Timothy, 1 Timothy. He would have those youthful lusts, and yet day by day, he passes this test. And not only did he not surrender to the temptation and give in to the temptation to sleep with her, but if you look at verse 10, it says that he wouldn't even be around her anymore. He avoided her like the plague. And that's very smart. That's a real key. He didn't want to even let himself be in that situation when the temptress would show up and drop those hints or those all-out propositions. He would just excuse himself. I don't want to be a part of this. The Bible tells us, make no provisions for the flesh. Don't set yourself up to fail. If you know that woman is going to be tempting you every day, then avoid that woman. When she comes into the room, you leave the room. Right? Make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lust thereof. Do not set yourself up to fail. Set yourself up to succeed. It's like the alcoholic going and sitting at the bar every night saying, oh, I'm only going to drink a Pepsi. I'm only going to drink a Pepsi. Why would an alcoholic, an ex-alcoholic, I should say, do that to themselves? They're setting themselves up to fail. No, you avoid it altogether. You cut off any opportunity for sin to be there. If you know those weak areas in your life, those things that trip you up and get you to fall to sin, then you cut those off. You limit those as much as you can, and that's what Joseph did. Verse 11. But, well, you can't get them all. You can't remove every opportunity for temptation. Verse 11. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside. Verse 12, that she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. Boy, that's like the only thing this woman knows to say. It's her favorite line, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. So she's grabbed him up by the coat. And in an attempt to bug out of there as quickly as he can, she still has a hold of his coat. And the coat, the garment, the outer garment comes off of him. Now, he's not, like naked at this point. It wasn't the only thing he had on, I wouldn't think. But she grabs him and he gets out of there so quick that his garment is left behind. Joseph was practicing 2 Timothy 2:22 long before it was ever written, which says, flee also youthful lusts. Get out of there. Run as fast as you can. Verse 13, and so it was, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, 14, that she called to the men of her house and spoke to them, saying, see, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. Pay really close attention to that statement that she makes. Who's she talking about there? She's talking about Potiphar, her husband. And what she's trying to do is get a coup going in her own home. She's trying to get all of the other household workers upset with Potiphar for bringing Joseph, this Hebrew, into the home. And I want to make that note there because we're seeing that there's some tension between Potiphar and his wife. And she's trying to take down Potiphar's household star, Joseph. She's trying to take him down, and she's trying to pin it all on Potiphar for bringing him into the home in the first place. Reading on. She says, he came into me to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. This is like a Me Too movement story here. I mean, it's just all a bunch of lies. She says, he tried to force himself on me, but I cried out. I cried out for help. Verse 15, and it happened when he heard that I lifted my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. The implication is he already started undressing. He was going to force himself on me. And when I started screaming for help, that saved me. He got worried that someone was going to hear. And then he darted off. And he left without his jacket. Verse 16. So she kept his garment with her until his master came home. Now she's got a big plan. She's going to set Joseph up. She's going to hang on to that garment. She's going to show it to her husband Potiphar when he gets home and tell him these same lies. Now, if you're wondering, this is a different garment. I know Joseph seems to have a lot of problems that center around coats. Coats get him into a lot of trouble, but this is a different coat than we read in Genesis 37, pardon me. This is not the coat of many colors. This is not his foreman's jacket, if you will, because that got ripped off of him, dipped in blood, and shown to his father as a way to convince his father that his son Joseph was dead. So this is a different coat. This is a different jacket. This is a different garment. But once again, this guy's having wardrobe problems. And this would be a coat or a garment that would reflect who he was in Potiphar's household. So once again, a coat is at the center of Joseph's problems. His fancy coat that he got from his dad caused a pretty big mess in the first place. And now his fancy Egyptian garment is going to be used as evidence against him to pin a crime on him that he didn't do. So learn the lesson, Anchored. Don't get a fancy coat. Just go on down to Gabe's. Buy yourself a cheap and a drab one, and you won't have to worry about these sort of problems. Now, all jokes aside, this just sort of comes with having the fancy coat in life. If you have a big position, if you're a bigwig, if you're a person of authority, if you're a person that's in leadership, there's just all sorts of problems that come with that. So we come to passages like this and we want to ask ourselves, do I really want the fancy coat? Do I really want the fancy coat at my job? Do I want to be the supervisor? Because that means, we have cell phones now. There is no escaping the job. I did that for many years. Someone wanted to call me at 3 a.m. and ask me about something at work the next day. I answered that phone. How about in the kingdom? Do we really want to wear the fancy coat in the kingdom? Are we really sure that we want to be the church leader? Are we really sure that we want to be in charge? I ask myself all the time, why would anyone want to do that? In the church, in the kingdom, why would anyone want a position of responsibility and authority? I never have. I've never wanted it. And I'm a firm believer that when someone is seeking a position of authority or responsibility or rule, when someone is seeking the fancy coat, that's the wrong person to give the fancy coat to. It's just true. When you put someone into a position of leadership, whether it's on the job like Joseph or in the church, you're looking for people that don't want to be leaders. They don't want to be rulers. They don't want to be in charge. They don't want to run things, but they will because the Lord called them to. That's the kind of people you're looking for. But if you got someone that's wanting the fancy coat or the position, watch out for them. Watch out for them. Verse 17, then she spoke to him Then she spoke to him with words like these, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me. Again, notice the tension between her and her husband. You did this. You brought this guy in, and now he's tried to rape me. Verse 18. So it happened as I lifted my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled outside. It was a close call. He almost had me. Verse 19. So it was, when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. So who was Potiphar's anger kindled against? That's sort of the million-dollar question. Now, if you think Joseph is the answer, I think you need to at least consider another possibility here. At this time in Egypt's history, do you know what the punishment for rape was? It was a capital offense. The punishment for rape was execution. So the way this should have played out was that when his wife said that Joseph tried to rape her, Joseph's life should have been taken from him, but that doesn't happen. All we read is that Potiphar is angry. Now, maybe you're wondering, well, if he's not angry at Joseph, which he may be, but if he's not angry at Joseph, then who is he angry at? Well, it's possible that he didn't believe his wife. It's possible that he would know that this is something that his wife would do, because it's very obvious she has an axe to grind over Joseph. She doesn't want him in there. So it is possible that these tensions between Potiphar and his wife over Joseph are what is frustrating him here and angering him here. It's possible that he's angry at the situation, because this guy loves Potiphar and, Joseph. He loves Joseph. And why wouldn't he? Look at what Joseph has done for his home. And now he realizes, he understands that because of the accusation, he's got to take his number one guy that's bringing wealth, prosperity, blessing into his home, and he's got to do away with the guy. So it could be quite possible that is the source of his anger here. Whatever it is, it's a true statement that by Potiphar throwing Joseph into prison, it is an act of mercy. That's about the most merciful thing that Potiphar, an Egyptian, could do given the set of circumstances. Verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Here he goes again. He begins as a slave. But God in him is so great that he moves his way up the ranks. His greatness is recognized. The blessing on his life is recognized. And he's placed as a leader in the home. Now he's in prison. Now it's worse. He's not a slave. He's a prisoner. It's worse. And yet we're already reading the prison isn't going to hold him, is it? Proverbs 16:7. Again, when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. And that's what I want my life marked with. I don't know about you. I know there will be people that hate me. And that's okay if people hate me for a time. But I'm always going to be trying to win that person over by just simply living for God. That's what I want to do. I just want to live so pure and so strong for God that wins over my enemies. I want my enemies to see God's blessing on me. Not me. I'm not trying to impress them. I'm not going to be flattering them. I just want to live for God, and I want that to be the thing that wins out in every situation in my life. Verse 22, and the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it to prosper. Isn't this amazing? Everywhere Joseph goes, God's blessing on his life is recognized. And when he gets promoted, which he inevitably does, the trust that is placed on him is so complete that people just let him run things completely. You have to put this into some perspective to really understand how gigantic this is. This is like a prisoner in our American corrections institutions, a prisoner becoming so respected within the prison that they give that prisoner rule over the whole correctional facility. Can you imagine such a thing? You can't, because it's impossible. But that's what's happening here. He's a prisoner. Now all of a sudden, he's in charge of the whole thing. The prison. Amazing. He just keeps working his way upward. And the Lord continues to prosper him. No matter what, even in spite of the setbacks that he faces. And let's make sure we get these words right here. We'll bring this to a close. But let's make sure we get these words right. Here's what it does not say. It does not say, and whatever Joseph did, it prospered. Did you see what it says? It says, whatever Joseph did, the Lord made it to prosper. And that's a big difference. The Lord was with him wherever he was. And he'll do the same for you. If you live in God's grace, that blessing goes wherever you go. And now that we are through with Genesis 38 and 39, I want to ask you this. Who do you most closely resemble in the two chapters? Maybe you're thinking, well, I don't associate very closely with Joseph because he just seems to be too perfect. The guy never makes a mistake, and that's going to keep up. He may frustrate you a little bit. You may get a little jealous of him. You may end up hating him. No, don't do that. I mean, he's just like, from our reading, he's a perfect guy. We know he's not a perfect guy in truth. But from our reading, he just seems like a perfect guy. So maybe you say, I have trouble associating with him. You know, there's people in the Bible I can associate with. I can associate with Simon Peter. I'm really good at shooting my mouth off at the wrong time. I'm really good. I would make a good Thomas. I can associate with him. I got to see proof, and I doubt anything else if I don't see proof. So maybe there's people in the Bible that you more closely relate to. I hope with all my heart that you don't relate to the two people that we read about in Genesis 38, Tamar and Judah. But even if you do, listen, here's the story. They found grace in the Lord's eyes. The Lord was determined to use both of them in the continuance of the Messianic line. What an act of grace. He wanted to use Tamar's womb. He wanted to use Judah's name, and he did it. You get to the genealogies in the Gospels, Matthew 1. The genealogy of Jesus through Joseph, the stepdad of Jesus. Now, that was the genealogy that would appeal to the Jews. It was the kingly genealogy, because the Jews want to know if someone's going to be king in Israel, where are his credentials? Show us the credentials. And that's the line of Jesus that goes back through through Joseph. This would be legal in the Jews' eyes, even though he wasn't the actual father of Jesus. It would be legal to them. And that line goes back through Perez, the son of Judah. Then you go to Luke 3, the genealogy of Jesus through the line of Mary. And you find that her line, which would be to the Gentiles the more legitimate line to study, the more legitimate family tree to study, because it's an actual flesh and blood parent, Mary. And that line goes back again through Perez, the son of Judah. So there's, in the Matthew 1 genealogy, an intentional drop of the name Tamar. I love this because Matthew knows when he's writing this that he is writing that genealogy for Jews. And Matthew is very intentional to drop that name to drop that name Tamar into the genealogy. You can read it for yourself. It doesn't need to be there. He drops that in. He wants to make sure that's in. Because Matthew is beginning to help us to understand and help the Jews understand the incredible grace of God that baffles our minds. He even throws the name Bathsheba in there. And so these two very unpleasant stories from the Bible, from which comes the messianic line eventually. Matthew's not afraid or ashamed to drop those into the genealogy of Christ, because whether you associate with Joseph and you've had a really good stretch where, man, you're just putting it together, victory after victory, faithfulness after faithfulness, you deserve a pat on the back for that. But maybe you're on the other end of the spectrum and you're needing a whole lot of the grace of God. Maybe that's your need. Lord, I've not had such a good year or a good decade or a good life, and I just need a lot of grace. Either way, there's grace for you. Tamar becomes the womb that is used for the Messiah. And Judah gets into those genealogies as well. And not only that, but it will be the name that Jesus uses in the future when he refers to himself. He'll be known as the Lion from the tribe of Judah. So wherever you are tonight, the blessing of God is available to you. The mercy of God is available to you. The Lord will prosper your life. Let's stand and we'll close in prayer.